Welcome to the Conscious Living Podcast, conversations to educate, empower, and enlighten our world. An uplifting and inspiring series of conversations and talks with your host, Jackie Woodside. We are educating minds, empowering lives, and enlightening souls to create a world where love prevails. In this engaging podcast, we deliver exciting, positive, transformative talks and teachings designed to elevate your life. Now, let's join our host, Jackie Woodside, for this week's session.
Hi, everybody. Jackie Woodside here for another extraordinary edition of the Conscious Living Podcast. We are here to educate, empower, and enlighten our world. And thank you for joining me, being another person that's committed to conscious living on this planet. And I'm so excited today to bring forward a colleague, a friend, and someone who is just a like-minded soul journeyer on this planet, Diane Hudock. Did I say that right?
I loved it. It was kind of French, which I really appreciate.
It was a little French.
Yeah,
how do you
Diane,
say it?
Yeah, Hudock pleader. And you know, it's funny.
I like Hudock Pletier.
Yeah, it was kind of sweet. I'm
you-
very funny with my maiden name, and for good reason, because I've gotten everything, as you can imagine, Hudock, and I always say it's Hudock. And I'm very adamant about that, Jackie, because I consider it, I say this humbly, a blessing, because Hugh is an ancient name for God. And I like to say I'm docked on God. Wow. So Diane Hudock, not Hudock.
Right? Oh, that's so, you're starting your spiritual teaching already. You're teaching about being awake and conscious. So Diane, why don't you just go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit to our listeners, say a little bit about just your background and who you are, and then we'll just dive into I'm just so excited to the topic of the biofield and spiritual psychology. I feel like we could be here for a week. So go ahead and just introduce yourself a little bit.
We could be here for quite some time. And I would love that. Yeah, so my background, I first started out really diving headfirst into yogic sciences. I went to India a bunch of times. I studied a great deal in India. I had an amazing teacher who's still a part of my life, who lives in India, taught me Kriya Yoga. I was an ambassador of this school of thought for over a decade. And as life goes, you evolve and you grow and you gravitate towards other things. So I went back to school and I just got this sort of spiritual hit to go get my master's degree in spiritual psychology, not even knowing really what the heck that even was. Right. I just knew I didn't want to be a sort of diagnostic where I picked up a DSM and said, you have personality disorder 1, 2, or 3. Let me send you to a psychiatrist who can give you some pills to numb that down, and not to poo-poo modern medicine.
I did that for 30 years. So I know what you're talking about.
There's a place for everything, right? But I just knew that wasn't for me and that wasn't my road. So lo and behold, of course, I looked up on the internet spiritual psychology, and there is a program. No longer, it's now sort of a certificate program, but when I was doing it, it was still a master's program in spiritual psychology at the University of Santa Monica here in Los Angeles. And the teachers of that, they both have their PhDs in psychology, and their spiritual teacher is the sort of chancellor of the school, and said for years, well, why don't you open up a school of spiritual psychology? I mean, psyche really does mean spirit. Why don't we bring it back and bring it round? So that's what they did. And it was, as you would imagine, a life-changing experience. And I went in there going, from an egoic state too, I thought, oh, this will give me an accreditation where I can write books. I'll have more, gravity in the world. That may all be true, but of course, as these things go, it was really for my own healing so that I could be of service to others. And you really recognize and realize that service is the highest foundation we can stand on.
And
So
is that what led you down your path of healing? It was
yeah.
the desire for service?
So, I don't even know if I really got the depth of what the power of being of service really meant until when I was in the spiritual psychology school, and it really just hit me like a ton of bricks in my heart. So even as a yoga teacher, I was being of great service, but I don't think it really opened my heart the way these other approaches to healing have. And what led me down the path initially of healing and wanting to help others is that there's always an impetus, right? For people, usually they're sick or they come from a broken home or there's their own trauma that they're looking to knowingly or unknowingly clear. So I grew up in a home that was both loving and very distressful and traumatic and imbalanced. And I may even use the word criminal. There was a lot of physical abuse and emotional abuse. And mental illness is really the calling card here. And I didn't really realize the level of mental illness that was going on until years later, when I actually was working with a mentor. And she said, "Do you realize that what you're describing is criminal?" And when she said that, it really just hit me in a way where, yeah, gosh, I've really normalized what really should not be normalized. And it was a moment of deep compassion that we really can all get in these patterns of enduring suffering, darkness, negativity, anything that's of a traumatic nature, and make it normal because it's just simply familiar. And then we make it okay. And then, of course, as these things go, we draw more experiences of the like to us until we recognize that we don't need to. So that was sort of the impetus, my upbringing. And then I got sick. And I was told that at one point I was told that I had a year to live, maybe. They're like, we'll see how it goes. They told me I had lupus when I was 19, and to kind of just watch myself. And I ended up going to drama school in London, and I ended up just having one of the greatest years of my life, being away from my family, being in an environment that was so embracing and loving and expansive and new and fresh and unfamiliar. Unfamiliar is the key. And I was doing what I loved, and I fell in love. And then I went to see the top world-renowned doctor specialist for lupus. And of course, with socialized medicine, it was free. And I got an appointment, and I went in to see this man when I was living in London for about a year and a half. And he looked at my blood work, and he took his time, kind of pondered it for a moment. And then he looked up at me and he said, "You don't have lupus." And I said, "You must be mistaken. You have to take a moment there and check that again," because I was so programmed, I was so conditioned that I had one foot in and one foot out of this world, getting ready to take off, because I was told by the guy in the white coat to kind of be ready, check it out, just watch yourself. And that was another turning point in my life, where it's like, hold on a minute, where am I giving my power and authority to? Am I giving it to all these people? And granted, they may be experts in their field, but if we're really conscious, and we are consciousness, then we recognize we can access this great collective of intelligence that can transmute and transform any physical condition of our life. So in short, I believe I healed myself through my joy.
Beautiful. Wow.
Yeah.
That is a beautiful, beautiful story. I'm so glad you did. I'm so glad you're still here after that 1 year that they gave you to live and then sent you off to keep an eye on things, and
30 years
how you were
later,
doing. So does this story that, we were talking before we got on air about the biofield, is this something that you learned through your illness process or later through spiritual psychology? Because I'm curious about what it is and what its relevance is to your work.
Yeah, great question. So I went and got my degree in spiritual psychology, and then I got another hit to continue on. And I went and decided I wanted to get my doctorate in spiritual science. I didn't even really know what that was at the time.
Right?
And then I found a school of spiritual science, which happened to be the chancellor of USM. This spiritual teacher named John Roger had opened up a school called Peace Theological Seminary and School of Philosophy. And he has a doctoral program. He created a doctoral program decades ago in spiritual science. So I thought, well, that's easy. That's a nice little, continuation. But the catch was I had to go back and go through the master's program in spiritual science to get a doctorate in spiritual science. So I had to get a second master's degree. I
Wow.
say had, it ended up being, of course, a blessing. And now I'm in my third year of my doctorate. And yeah, so that was sort of the next step. And while I was doing that, I was guided to go into frequency medicine. And I just started meditating on trying to find the next thing I wanted to do. Is it related to hands-on healing? So I was guided to two particular techniques or approaches, one being biofield tuning and the other being what we would call touch for health, which is a form of energy kinesiology. And so biofield tuning came into my stratosphere back in about 2012. And I ended up doing the training with this wonderful woman, Eileen McCusick, who's really a pioneer in biofield science. And if people are wondering what the heck the biofield is, the biofield is really, it encompasses all of your electrical body, meaning you're not just this body made of flesh and bones and blood. You are also an electrical or energetic being. And for anyone that goes, well, what do you mean by that? I could simply just use the example of, well, how do we measure the health of a heart? We use an electrocardiogram, right? So we can measure things of the body using energy, electricity, and sound frequency, like a sonogram to pick up the health of a baby in a womb. So the biofield is this toroidal, it's like a donut, which a toroid is in shape, that extends out about 5 to 6 feet from your body. The biofield makes up your electrical being or body in its entirety, meaning your electrical body and the electrical plasmic field that surrounds the body. And it's really made up of what we would call the fourth state of matter, which is plasma. And plasma is both equal parts positive and negative particles. It's ionized gas that's made up of positive and negative particles. And that's very sort of technical and sort of quantum physicsy, but it's really a field. It's a field of consciousness. And in that field, in that plasmic bubble, holds all of your experiences that you've ever had in your life. It's stratified, it's timelined like rings on a tree. There is the outer layer, and there are all kinds of indentations or information that we can pick up in the biofield through using what we would call tuning forks or frequency forks, or simply frequency. And so I've been trained to listen and recognize the tonal pathology of one's field. So when I am using a fork, I find the edge of someone's field called the ionosphere, which is essentially the birth. And I slowly comb back into the body on the table. Now, the interesting part of this work is since COVID hit, my business shifted dramatically, of course, to, like a lot of people, to online. And I was started seeing so many people without having bodies on the table. And the thing is, in your rational mind will go, this is ridiculous. There's no one there, and yet it's working. And that's really just another principle of quantum physics, because the quantum is not relegated by time or space. The consciousness is not fixed or relegated by time or space. You are not relegated by time or space. So this work works, it travels faster than the speed of light. So what I do is, through the power of our intention, put your hologram on the table, and I find the edge of your field, and I work through the fourth state of matter, finding, listening, working with, to break up all of the sound heard distortions, perturbations that show up in the timeline of your biofield.
And then you put the hologram on the table.
So since I don't have a physical body,
right,
I take what another term might be called like the etheric body double. It's almost like an X-ray, an energetic plasmic copy of your physical body.
And how do you do that?
Through intention.
Oh,
I take it, I pick it up, and I put it there. Now, this is where I go back to the rational mind will never be able to compute and break this down. It's just like you can't think your way to God or the God of your understanding.
right.
You feel your way. It's through the gateway of the heart. You can't get it through your brain because your brain can't compute something so infinite.
Right. Like we cannot think our way to infinity.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. So I always share the very first time I did this, which was even more profound because there was not even a person on screen across from me on a Zoom. I was in my training, and I have to do, of course, so many to be certified. And I had to do some distance sessions. And this guy was not willing to get on Zoom, to get on the telephone, to be in the room. If it was a distance session, so he wouldn't be anyway. The point is, I simply told him, okay, so-and-so, I'm going to be doing your biofield at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. Just notice what you notice, and I'll send my findings to you. And essentially I ended up sending the findings to his wife, who was a client of mine. Now, you can imagine my sort of reluctance to do this, because if I'm wrong, I'm going to feel pretty weird and bad.
Yeah.
And my job is, from the training I received, to trust what's coming present, since I can recognize the tonal pathology, the landscape of the field. So I just was in my living room. I intended, through my intention, I put this man's hologram on a table. Nobody's there. And I find through intention his field. And you find, as you do in this fourth state, it's matter. It's a fourth state of matter. Okay. It plasma glows just like the stars and the aurora and the nebulae and the lightning that strikes the ground. That's all plasma. 99% of the visible universe is plasma. So this is actually, with intention, there's a structure to it. Without intention, you could just be kind of waving a fork around and into nothing. So with intention, I found the edge of his field, no problem. And then I started finding information, getting feedback in the fork, getting all kinds of readings. And my job is just to write it down. Two very interesting things that happened was that the room started reeking of bourbon. So what do I do with that is, well, I write down he's medicating himself with bourbon. And the second thing that was really profound was I started shaking, kind of very, very, almost, it felt like kind of like I was having a seizure. And I don't mean that disrespectfully for anyone that's ever experienced that, because I don't know what that's like, but that's what it felt like in my body. And so I wrote down what it felt like, and it happened twice. Now, I had to write that down and pass on without judgment, without my editing the findings. So I knew I was working the left side. The left side in biofield tuning is it's often the female input, and the right side would be the male input. So I knew there was issues with the mom, and it was very pervasive through the entire field on that side. So I sent these findings off to his wife, and she said, how did you know he had a seizure when he was something like 4 and 16? I don't remember. It was so long ago. But that's exactly what I felt. It was etched like a brass rubbing in his field as a sin wave, as a memory imprint, as an energetic waveform that was seeking to be released, to be brought back into a state of harmony, back into a state of resonance, not dissonance, not static. So biofield healing really is about bringing all these misunderstandings, these judgments, these limited belief systems, limited interpretations, traumas, restrictions, self-attack, you name it, and bringing it all back into a state of music, harmony, balance, understanding, compassion, rather than noise, rather than stuckness. We want it to be syntropic, not entropic.
That's fantastic. Wow. And how does the healing occur? What actually happens in the biofield that creates that syntropic environment?
We are raising the voltage, essentially, of your electrical body using frequency. And different frequencies support different conditions, right? And so what we're doing is we're combing, scooping, ushering this lost resource. And to be more specific, what we're really breaking up are these kind of calcifications, or again, perturbations, like a knotted ball of yarn and stuff, which is knotted up light and sound, biophotons and biophonons. You are made up of light. We're all made up of light. When we die, we have all kinds of scientific studies on how we can measure this sort of release, this natural process of dying, where we're releasing a lot of biophotonic activity. That's why we don't do biofield healing per se, at least in this way, with someone who's in the active state of dying, because we don't want to put light back in that naturally wants to leave. So what we're doing in the living being, and that being which is here still in its completions and growth phase, we are putting that lost light. It's almost like a shamanic soul, how would I put it? You're grabbing, or you're reaching, or you're gathering lost bits of the self, kind of like a Gestalt therapy, all those disintegrated parts of the self. And so that is lost light, and it's all jumbled up, and it's not resource. So we unjumble it, we make it usable resource, and we pick it up and usher it, direct it, guide it back into its proper place in the body. That might be the heart, that might be the belly, that might be the right hip, that might be your head. It just depends where that imbalance or that distortion shows up. And there are ways where we measure that. We check that out through different protocols.
Amazing. I love it. This is making me think of, there's a realm of things that you know, and then there's a realm of things that you know that you don't know. And then there's a realm of things that you don't know that you don't know. I didn't know that I didn't know all this. This is so fascinating. So do you want to tie this in with spiritual psychology? Is there a connection, an overlap, or can we shift gears there? Because I'm also very interested in those principles and that work.
Yeah. So spiritual psychology is really, it's a learning orientation to life. It's really seeing through soul-centered lens rather than our sort of basic selfness.
Like rather than through the ego, kind of
Yeah,
seeing people through the
yeah,
sense of soul and essence rather than through the egoic mind.
absolutely. And so we recognize that first and foremost, we are souls here having a human experience. We are not human beings, I should say, with souls. We are souls
Oh, wow, with
using,
body.
we are souls using, which I think is key, a human experience for the
Wow.
purpose of awakening.
Yeah, yeah.
So the awakening process, just like the healing process, is not an event. Healing is not an event, it's a process. And physical world reality exists for the sole purpose of our growth and upliftment, or for the sole purpose of our spiritual awakening.
Yes.
Thus, all of life is for our learning and growing spiritually.
I teach that in many of my programs that are, you don't have to walk around wondering, trying to sort out what your purpose is. Your purpose for you, me, and all of humanity is that we are here to grow in consciousness back to the divinity from which we came.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
There are no mistakes, only opportunities for learning, healing, and awakening.
And awakening, right? Everything that's happening in your life is for your growth and awakening.
Yeah.
And
And
people
also,
come at it that way. It's so much more gentle and empowering. But anyway, go ahead. What were you going to say?
oh, yeah. I was just, off of what you were just saying, it made me think of another principle. There's 33 principles in spiritual psychology. And another principle that I always come back to is that nothing outside of you causes your disturbances,
Right.
which is
Giving
like
a talk on that on Sunday, like that exact concept I'm speaking on
nice.
Sunday. Nothing outside of you causes your disturbances. So for somebody who's maybe new to that idea, they're like, what are you talking about? My boss causes my disturbances all the time. My kids are constantly causing me disturbances. So say more, Diane. What do you mean by that?
Well, it kind of brings me to a teaching in spiritual psychology, which is outer world reality is a direct reflection of our inner world state.
Yeah.
So any unresolved issue is anything that disturbs your peace. And if we keep living our lives based on emotional content rather than through our creation mode, meaning emotional content, reaction, right? Like, you insulted me today, I had a bad day. You were nice to me today, it was a good day. Then we're always going to be spinning our wheels, because our happiness is determinant on the outer world or other people's behaviors to determine how we should feel. And then we're completely disempowered. And really, anything that causes a contraction in you, we would call in spiritual psychology a curriculum, or we might call that person, my teachers, Ron and Mary Holnick, will call them stackers. They're your stackers. And, my boss is always blah, 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 right? He could be a stacker. He makes you contract, but it's really, from a spiritual parlance, he's really bringing awareness to something inside of you that is seeking to be healed. It's an unresolved issue. So really the question is, how does it relate to me? This person, my boss, who's really annoying me and making me feel all these negative things, he may be operating out of a place of misalignment. But if you're rooted in your knowing, if you're rooted in your center, if you're rooted in your loving, then really no one or thing can disturb your peace. We either create it, promote it, or allow it. So then you ask yourself, well, why am I allowing that? Oh, maybe because you think unconsciously you deserve it. Maybe you unconsciously think you deserve to be insulted. maybe and this could go way back. This is kind of where it pulls into biofield tuning, because biofield tuning, we help to source where that sort of belief got seeded in the subconscious. And then you anchor it there as a construct, as an energetic construct. So everything in life is here for us as an opportunity to dissolve and transmute any of these curriculums, any of these conditions that we deem as negative. We can literally heal them, and thus we're really healing ourselves. And we see that no one, nobody, no thing has the power to destroy our peace.
So the way you're talking about it, it sounds like, I mean, can people access this healing without a, biofield practitioner or without a spiritual psychology therapist? Like, how can people do this on their own? How can you help people not feel so overwhelmed with this?
Yeah, I love your questions, Jackie.
Thank you.
Well, the general response, kind of the overarching response is, I feel anytime we want to grow in life into the unknown, it behooves us to find a teacher who's walked the path, who can guide us. It's like if you want to learn how to meditate and access certain levels of your consciousness, go study with a meditator who's been doing it for 20 years, right? You want to learn how to make a great sandwich, go study with a chef who makes great sandwiches. You want to learn how to throw a football, go study with a coach who teaches you how to throw the ball right at the right angle and the right grip. So having a teacher who's walked the path would behoove us in anything that we want to transform in my life. But to your question, how do we do it ourselves? You can just first start by claiming the authority vested in you that you're a soul having a human experience, meaning we're all the same. We all have access, regardless of our skill, regardless of our education, regardless of our background, regardless of our acumen, regardless of our level or what we believe is our level or other people's levels of wisdom that's present. We all have access to this divine consciousness. And that divine consciousness is the consciousness that heals and transforms. It's the loving. That's your ground zero. So you can just do something so simple. I give this in every session I've ever done. And I've probably done about, 2,000 biofields at this point. I probably did my 2001 biofield this morning. And but I do it in every single one. And it is a teaching from spiritual applied psychology. And I'll give it to your audience here as something they can walk away with. And it's a practice that we call compassionate, unconditional self-forgiveness. And it's a formula that serves to repattern your consciousness. And I always kind of refer to one of my spiritual teachers who would describe what this does. And when a little boy at a talk one day some years ago said to John Roger, "Why do we want to clear our consciousness?" He said, "Well, just imagine that your consciousness is like the windshield on your car, and you're driving on a road and you want to stay on that road. You want to stay on the best road possible so you don't go off-roading into the muck and the suffering and the drama. So all that soot and dirt that accumulates on your windshield is all those judgments, all those misinterpretations, all those limiting beliefs, all that guck that blocks you from your core essence. So we want to clear that. So it behooves us to clear or repattern our consciousness. And so the process goes like this. I forgive myself for judging myself for or as, and then you fill in the blank. And the important thing with this statement, this affirmation, this process, is that we're not saying, I forgive myself for ... Like, let's say you did a lot of drugs and you have shame around that. You don't go into a process of saying, I forgive myself for doing all these drugs. I forgive myself for taking a lot of heroin. I forgive myself for smoking all those cigarettes. No, it's the judgment that creates the calcification in the consciousness, or clearing the judgment. I always think of someone that I did a healing with in the early days, and I still see this guy, and we always kind of joke about it. And it was, and of course, I hope people really get the context of my point here. This is not for me to encourage or say that taking drugs is good. I am not saying that at all, but I'm using it as a point of reference, in that I found in this man's field, he was doing cocaine, and it showed up. There's a tonal frequency. There's feedback that you get with that. And I shared that with him. And so, but what was fascinating is it wasn't a place of lost resource. It wasn't a place of noise. It wasn't a place that was lacking harmony or music. Mm-hmm. What was so fascinating is that it was actually a place of great expansion. And I had never seen that before, and I've actually never seen it again. It was only one time. But he was in such a place of joy that it overrided the negative impacts of taking this drug, which would usually, normally, 99.999% of the time, show up as a distortion in someone's field. So reason I'm sharing this is because it's like, he didn't have to clear that. He didn't have to forgive himself for doing cocaine. But for someone else who was in a place of a lot of sadness or anything that they were going through, and then they went to drugs to numb themselves, that's a whole different thing. So I forgive myself for judging myself for that thing or for that belief is really what we're doing here. And then the second sort of part to that is because the truth is. So it's like, I forgive myself for judging myself for ever believing that I'm unworthy of loving or of love, of receiving true love. Because the truth is, and then you can kind of just sit with it. And it's like, you cannot get this process wrong. You just sit in your heart. And if I always say to my clients, if your heart could speak, what would it say? And that gets them out of their head and into their heart. And they go, well, I forgive myself for judging myself, for ever believing that I'm unworthy of receiving love, because the truth is that that's the greatest lie I could ever set forth in motion. I am the loving. It's like, that's right. And so in some ways, and you get this being a psychologist, in some ways I compare it a bit to RET, rational emotive therapy, because we're kind of rationally emoting like, well, is that really true? Prove it. Oh, really? You're unworthy of loving? Prove it. I can't. Right.
So great. That's a really lovely, lovely tool. And really appreciate you sharing that with people. So your practice is primarily working one-on-one with people. What you do, groups? What is your practice, Diane?
Yeah, my practice mostly is working one-on-one. I've really, I just love seeing people's growth individually in their own organic, divine way. It's very rewarding.
And are you like a doctor's visit where people like show up, you give them, kind of the diagnosis and some treatment, and then they go off? Or how is it more like a therapist where people show up kind of week after week? Which model are you?
Yeah, that's great. Well, I always say, as we say, healing is a process. It's a process, not event. So when people say, how many of these should I do? I always think of my mentor, and she would say, well, how empowered do you want to be? How on the grid of life do you want to be? I, Diane, personally, really want to be in my fullest potentiality. And it's never ending. As long as I'm alive, embodied, I have curriculum. And as you get more and more empowered, of course, that curriculum will change as life becomes more and more graceful and easeful and abundant, and you're living in coherence with all the soul attributes of health and wealth and prosperity and abundance and loving and caring and sharing and fulfillment and joy and freedom and liberation. So on that road to reclaiming all that, there's stuff to clear so that you know that you know that you know. And so everyone's different. And I, out of my own integrity, I like to, once I'm in someone's field, then I can, and we've done the session, then I can get a clearer roadmap of when their next session would be. Now, it depends on what's present for them. If someone's going through something really intense, like a divorce or a death or a chronic illness or something that really needs some juice, we do something that's kind of very scientific. You would probably recognize this again in psychology. We utilize the practice of entrainment. Yeah. So we kind of want to poke the dog enough, but we want to also give them some time to digest. But we don't want them to wait too long before they come back, because we don't want them to go back to their old factory settings. So for some people in the beginning, it's one every week for a couple months. For some people, it's one every month. For some people, it's one every 4 weeks, until you start to get your voltage up enough that you feel you're standing on a new level of inner foundation.
Oh, fantastic. I love what you're doing. It's so extraordinary. So I have a sense that a lot of our listeners might want to know where to find you, and especially now that you work remotely and it doesn't have to be people in the LA area. So what's the best way for people to find you?
Yeah, they could just go to my website, which is www.alchemyofmastery.com.
Ooh, that gives me chills. Alchemyofmastery.com. That is fantastic. Yeah. That is fantastic. So I'm going to send people there to connect with you further, to follow you, and just to be in your energy field. I feel lifted up just having spent this time with you, Diane. So thank you for your generosity, your wisdom, your knowledge, and how much you've shared with our audience today. It's just been an absolute blessing to be with you.
Oh, it's such a pleasure, Jackie. And I might add before we go that my podcast that you were so gracious to be on, Spiritual Geek Out Podcast, and people love your talk, by the way. So I encourage all your listeners to come over and listen to your talk on the Spiritual Geek Out Podcast.
Spiritual Geek Out Podcast. Awesome. Thank you so much. That's right. We did that together as well. Let's keep finding new ways to collaborate together. Okay.
So
awesome. Thank you.